It's my pleasure. It's been a very inspirational morning. I hope you all agree, yeah? Yeah, it's been fantastic. Fantastic speakers, and it's my pleasure to introduce another speaker to you. I did note the comment here about young people at life expectancy moving towards being 100 years for young people. Now, my daughter was born on the 21st of December 1999, so she has a very real chance of living in 3 centuries. Can you imagine that? Now, I won't be there to see it, obviously, but part of the reason why, obviously, life expectancy is getting longer is the tremendous advances in medicine. And so the speaker that I want to introduce today is Professor Max Crispin, who is the Professor of Glycobiology. I have to keep rehearsing that. Glycobiology at Southampton University. After studying for his degree and his PhD in Oxford in biochemistry, Max is now the Professor at Southampton University of Glycobiology. And 4 years ago, he started an organisation and a movement called Against Breast Cancer. And this is research into secondary breast cancer. And I know personally it's touched my life, I'm sure many of you as well. So it's very, very important work. Cisco is supporting Against Breast Cancer. We are supporting and sponsoring a PhD student to work with Professor Crispin in his studies. And I will come back and give a rallying call for donations and ways that you can support afterwards. But without further ado, I'm going to introduce Professor Max Crispin.
So it's a wonderful honour to be able to speak to you today about our work on developing new generation of therapies against breast cancer. Now, it's a remarkable statistic that 1 in 8 women will be diagnosed with breast cancer during their lifetime. And 1 in 5 of those will have breast cancer that isn't confined to the breast, which can be treatable, but actually metastasizes, moves away from that site, and that presents a significant challenge in therapy. Now, things have improved remarkably over the decades, and yet currently breast cancer takes the lives of 12,000 women in the UK every year, and actually even 70 men. So it's these types of stories that really sort of motivates us to look at ways of improving antibody therapeutics in particular. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story, which starts with Oxford-based charity Against Breast Cancer, moves to Oxford University, where they first started supporting me, and now I'll go on and tell you about the exciting story of our move to the University of Southampton. Now, this journey begins actually with a remarkable couple, Tony and Pat Leatham. Now, Tony was a clinician, and while he was active, he was exposed to many of the people that have been diagnosed with breast cancer and was rather moved into action. Now, he was doing his own research, but didn't have any sort of financial means to really support that. So, together with Pat, they began to brainstorm how to sort of unblock this situation. And actually, Tony, in his white coat, stood outside the tube station in Oxford Street with a tin and began to fundraise about 30 years ago. And actually, there was such a remarkable sight that a passerby ran to Fleet Street, told the newspapers what was going on, and they all descended, not only on the tube station, but later at their family home in Oxfordshire. And then a few years later, that emerged into the charity Against Breast Cancer. Now, Tony's research actually has really shaped some of my own thinking and training in the world of breast cancer. And he actually identified or showed that a protein isolated from plants, that was capable of binding to the surface of cells through sugar modifications. Now, these are chemically the same thing as dietary sugars, but all your cells are covered in this surface of sugars. And he was able to show, using this protein, that he could predict the severity of breast cancer based on the binding of this agent. And he went on to publish a really important paper in The Lancet, sort of outlining this key feature. Now, this is where I come in. These sugar changes actually, if a plant lectin, this plant protein, can bind and distinguish cells, why can't you use other things that are more therapeutically active? And of course, it's not just me. There's a big, long history, actually, of looking at how you can use the immune system in order to clear cancer. And so where I come in is Against Breast Cancer funding me to look at the changes that occur in this carbohydrate system using the state-of-the-art technology which is now available, and to develop antibodies. You see my little silly cartoon here of an antibody. And we're actually trying to re-engineer your normal immune system, manufacture this, and we can actually administer that as part of treatments. Now, these are already clinically available, but there are limits to how effective they are. And what we're trying to do is make a second-generation form of the drug to actually improve patient outcomes. Now, this relies on a very dynamic team, young team, and they are tasked with quite a formidable challenge, and that is to be inventive, come up with a new drug, which sounds terrifying, doesn't it, put like that? In fact, I find myself in front of this large audience thinking the same myself now. And thinking back, there are strategies that you can adopt to be inventive and that you can train people to be inventive. And just taking the example of an antibody, well, you can think, well, what stops this antibody being even better? Now, it could be the ability to bind to the target cell, distinguish cancer cells from host cells, or it could be, well, how does your immune system even recognize an antibody bound to a cell, given that you've got grams and grams of antibodies knocking around your bloodstream? So you can start to think about, what can you overcome in terms of natural barriers? Tumours, for example, have ways of turning off the immune system. They're so-called anti-inflammatory. So even if you get an antibody binding, you've got a series of problems. So we encourage people to sort of start to think systematically about how you can unblock some of these things and inspire new products which we then go and test. So the lab was really exciting, being based in Oxford. So what would lure someone out of Oxford? And in fact, there's growing legions of people now moving to Southampton. Now, the vision that Southampton had was to actually recognise that they had a huge history and strength in developing these so-called immunotherapies. And so the university decided to really consolidate this and set out with a £25 million campaign, which has proved successful, to actually build a dedicated centre for cancer immunology in order to develop new therapies. And donations came from 8,000 donors and supporters, a lot of alumni, obviously been in Southampton, a lot of donations from the Channel Islands, local government support. But they've now achieved that. Now, this was the vision, a dedicated centre where you could bring together all sorts of people, from the basic scientists to clinicians to patients, to create a hub where the idea that you can come up with these scientific ideas, have a really realistic chance of progressing that difficult journey to the clinic. So they started by just literally on a bit of a paper, I imagine, thinking, well, we need space for our scientific developments, but why not stick it on top of our dry working space for these sort of more advanced computational and biophysical work and write-ups, but why not put it on top of a clinical trials unit? So this means the scientists, during their break, are actually interacting with the very people organising the trials, makes their ideas, they have to meet a certain quality and realism of what takes a successful drug in the clinic. So it's incredibly good. I like this picture because it plays to my technical leanings, but you can imagine the team getting together and thrashing out the design of this lab. So very complicated, meeting the needs of a diverse range of scientific disciplines. And in February 2006, our Vice-Chancellor, shown at the front, together with, I hope you can spot him, what I think is going to be a budding young cancer immunologist in the future, burying the time capsule. And shortly afterwards, we now quickly emerged the shiny new building. And as of very recently, we marked the successful completion of that fundraising event. We show here, it really is not me that should have any credit here, but the team in Southampton, led by Tim Elliott, who really saw this vision through. And they've been very keen on showing him in various variety of poses for Twitter and social media to sort of show the success. But of course, this is the start of the journey. What you see now is a big empty lab. You'll never see a lab this clean ever again. I'm quite impressed. But of course, this brings me to how Cisco can help. And of course, what you might be seeing is missing test tubes and Bunsen burners and pots with different coloured liquids. But actually the most important thing we're missing here are people. And, of what we've heard today, every organisation shares. You're only as good as the team that you have. And, of course, with any discipline, any area, you need to invest in the training of the new generation of people. And one of the reasons why I think you should be really thinking about supporting a new PhD student is that will take a talented young scientist and train them up to work in breast cancer, which impacts so many people. So what this person will be doing, they'll be distributed between sort of two centres. There's the existing centre, where titled here, Antibody Design in the Life Sciences. Now there we have all our analytical equipment, big machines, I'll show you some. And they'll be required to come up with ideas, characterise some of the molecules they're making, work in the neighbouring cellular testing facility, the brand new ones, near the clinics, and they'll have the freedom in all sorts of ways to just move between these centres, get whatever support they need, and to iteratively test ideas and push it through. So I can't think of any more worthy place to be putting other than supporting the training. This is an example. I've promised to give you a little window into the scientific life. This is a lab in Southampton with a bewildering array of equipment that sort of bright lights, goes bing, all that sort of stuff. But what we offer is training. You'll see here one of the members of my lab, Gemma, learning to use very expensive and high-end equipment. And it might look like she's operating a sort of 1980s supercomputer. But actually, these are state-of-the-art mass spectrometers, which, to give you this sort of indication of the sort of price of biomedical research, you wouldn't get much change out of £1 million for that box. So there's an incredible economic burden that we all face in order to deliver cutting-edge research. That sounds like a big burden, but people are happy. The nice thing is, I had to bribe her a lot. No, this was quite natural. To be inventive, you need freedom to think and flexibility and to control your own destiny. So over a typical PhD, you'd spend 3 or 4 years. And it's really, we're very proud of being able to give environments where people can grow, to learn, and to be a sort of master of their own day, their own week, their own journey. And we try to encourage those new ideas. So really, whilst I run the lab, it's really the other way around. I'm entirely inspired and led by the people actually doing the experiments. And actually, Cisco have a major role in kickstarting that for another individual. This is another example of the range of equipment that we ask people to learn. And in this particular case, the student has manufactured an antibody themselves, purifying it, then they're going to characterise it. They're in charge, cradle to grave, for the entire system, including this is an example of a facility that we'll be opening up in the new building, where we can test the effectiveness of these molecules in cellular assays you see growing in these little wells here. And we've got a very good understanding about the properties that antibodies need to have in order to be effective in the clinic. So this student can actually do iterative rounds of improvements. So that leads me to just hopefully leave you with that message, that exciting message about the investing in the next generation of students and this potential really as individual scientists to be able to make an impact. And finally, on this day celebrating the contribution of women, I'd like to really thank Patricia Leatham, who was of course the founding director of Against Breast Cancer, and it's really her efforts over the years that have made it the charity that it is today. So thank you all so much, and open to questions. Okay. Good. Thank you.
Okay, so do we have any questions for Professor Crispin? Okay, we have a question here. Jenny?
Hi, Professor. I don't know if it's deliberately, but you've shown 2 pictures of women scientists on your photos. Is it difficult to hire women into the science profession like it is women into technology?
Very good question. Of course, with any very technical area, that sort of journey starts at school. And actually, we broadly speaking, my impression is that there isn't a huge problem in getting women into undergraduate degrees, for example. When I was an admission tutor in Oxford, their statistics were very good, and often there'd be more women recruited into the biochemistry course than men. It was pretty 50-50. So that, everybody seems to be very good at supporting careers there. And even going through, the conversion of people into higher degrees is very good. Where the problem emerges, and this is probably shared in a number of industries, is that next phase, the sort of child family intensive years. And that's where we see the sort of bifurcation happening and people moving to other careers which potentially a little bit more supportive. I mean, the difficulty is the requirement to maintain quite an international presence. And I don't have any sort of wonderful solutions for this other than perhaps organisations can be a bit more proactive in identifying promising and successful women earlier on before this carnage happens and offering meaningful support, and so that they emerge having raised family in a position to land the very top jobs. So that's my observations.
Any other questions at all? There we go. Lisa? Oh, one at the back there first, sorry. I'll see.
Yeah, I just had a quick question, because obviously Oxford Uni and that whole area has quite got a concentration of cancer research sites, and there's some really great breakthroughs with like Oxford Biomedica and places and institutes like that. But is there plans for obviously this specific institute to collaborate with obviously some of the other work that's going on with Cell Catapult, Oxford Biomedica, and some of that research? Because I'd read a statistic, and it might not be true, but it was around all the data that we have globally on a lot of research in terms of specific cancers. If we had a giant computer that could process all of the big data, then we would find out the cure for everything. Which obviously is quite a sweeping statement, but have you got plans for that sort of collaboration piece as well?
Well, I was actually at an event prior to in the build-up to the launch of the new building, where they're reviewing all their partnerships that they already have that will then be moved into this institution. And it's remarkable depth of this network, which I'm only just really learning about as a new arrival to Southampton. But what's really remarkable is not only the collaborations amongst the academic community, but really the number of collaborations reaching into industry. If you're going to be developing a drug, your highest the highest chance of success is with industrial partners. So actually, it's not about UK region. The partnership is really truly global, from big pharma right the way down to small biotech, and the number of partnerships is phenomenal. So the plans are there. Whether you can pull out a cure for cancer just by computationally mining that, well, I'm all ears. Speak to me afterwards.
Just a practical question, just building on that. How have you actually found collaborating both internationally and with other organisations who are doing similar type of research to kind of get the best out of it, sort of the 1 + 1 = 3? What do you actually do? What are your lessons learned?
Well, I have two hats in a way, and with the nature of being a glycobiologist, with these specialising on these sugar modifications, is it's actually applicable to a number of diseases. And we have one programme funded by the Gates Foundation, which has really opened up my eyes about what's possible in bringing people together. And what's remarkable is that network, as I was talking about before, between scientists getting together with people who are familiar with the industrial sort of process, manufacturing requirements for drugs. And actually what's really reassuring about the move to Southampton is much of that stuff that I saw of really excellence in the Gates Foundation and organisations like that are mirrored in the very fabric of the building. So I have high hopes that people will be talking together, and they've engineered it deliberately, precisely for that. Very good question.
Any more? Is there one here?
Hello. John mentioned earlier that at Cisco are helping to fund a researcher. So I was just interested to know how close we are and what we can do better to help you.
Well, I mean, by close we are, we're in the process of recruiting that student. So we there's the Cancer Immunology Department run a consolidated interview process. So basically, when funds are available, as they look likely, so we'll be able to strike. So time is now, and time is urgent. There are certain cycles to the employment of students. So if there's any plea, it would be, be proactive. Beyond that, of course, there's a massive wish list. I mean, the nature of these programs is they can always be accelerated. So basically, the scope for improving equipment, putting the tools that people need directly in their hands without having to go to a neighbouring building, getting the latest technologies in. There's a wish list, phenomenal wish list. But first things first, if we can begin training that person, that's a huge step.
Do we have another question over here?
Sorry. So my aunt relatively recently was diagnosed with breast cancer. I'm not entirely sure of the details of it, but she's gone through the double mastectomy and she's gone through a lot, and she's now, instead of going through what the doctors are recommending her, she is now, thanks to some people on the internet, convinced that a vegan lifestyle is going to save her life, and doing all these sort of, as she calls them, holistic things to try and cure her cancer. How much have you found that these sort of internet, I suppose scam is the wrong way to say it, but these sort of internet opinions of people who believe they know the cure to cancer, has that impacted your work at all?
Can I answer this question in two ways first? I mean, firstly, the scientific question, does diet and lifestyle have an impact? Well, Against Breast Cancer have funded for many years a study in probing exactly that. And, there is a pattern between the tendency for cancer to recur, and in fact for even you to be diagnosed, with some of the sort of diet and lifestyle choices that are made. So actually, I've used the word choice. Everybody does have, to a certain degree, some choice in their lifestyle and the amount of exercise they have, their nutrition. And it's like almost every other disease, the better you are at looking after yourself, the more likely, there's just statistics, you are going to have lack of recurrence or not be diagnosed in the first place. So there are technical reasons behind that, which I could elaborate on. But basically, you can imagine cancers, they need fuel. And if you have a higher body mass index, basically you have a lot more tendency to have aggressive cancers. So there are things you can do to limit your risks. Now, as for internet, the latest thing is, it's a difficult question to ask. I mean, you have to be very careful about taking advice on the internet, and I would always recommend talking to your local GP about getting direct advice. Yes, there's a big spectrum of accuracy out there. So.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more, if anybody has one. It's hard to see from here. Any more?
I'll ask a question then. So how would you explain then the growing number of people diagnosed with cancer?
Well, so there's, just in a very simple way, you get the longevity. We're all living longer. And of course that reveals, you're more likely to have a diagnosis the longer you live. So that's probably number one. And number two is going to be connected to your diet and lifestyle. So I think those two together can pretty much account for it. I'm not an epidemiologist, but my impressions of those two really are very, very most significant things. In a way, you could say that cancer is an incredibly rare event. Now, before I get shouted at, what I'm saying is you've got gazillions of cells in your body, and actually you're remarkably good at not having cancer. It's just when it happens, it can cause issues. So actually, the longer you live, the more accumulated mutations you get in this vast number of cells, and the more likely you are to have an event. So yeah, that's it's sort of a product of our long life expectancy.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, I think we'll end there. So thank you so much indeed.
Cheers. Thank you very much.
Thank you.